The next person I would like to introduce is Gary Aguirre. Gary Aguirre was an attorney, litigator for 27 years. He then decided to embark on a new career. He attended and received a master's degree from Georgetown Law School in the area of international finance and SEC. While there, he wrote a paper that SEC selected as the second best paper written about the SEC and commodity and securities. And then he was hired by SEC. He was put in charge of an investigation of Pickwatt Capital Management, which at that time was the largest hedge fund on Wall Street. He then discovered, or evidence came in, of potentially insider trading. He was pursuing an investigation, somewhat routine, and then he then determined that he needed to talk to a pillar of Wall Street who was potentially engaged and had evidence that was necessary for his investigation. At that time, everything came to a screeching halt. All of a sudden, his investigation was taken away from him, and he was fired and forced out. Over several years, the Senate Banking and the Senate Judiciary Committees conducted a thorough investigation of his experience, and they found in his favor absolutely across the board in terms of he had operated and acted according to his oath, and that his termination was arbitrary and unfair, and he won the day. In addition to that, he then pursued the evidence through FOIAs. He won a federal case on FOIA, received many of the documents that then proved that what he was engaged in and what he was seeing needed to be investigated thoroughly, and that he was right about his determination of what needed to happen in that investigation. He now is an attorney for whistleblowers. He is an expert, obviously, on the SEC, and it's my pleasure to introduce him by Skype, and let's hear what he has to say. Gary.
Louis, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you, Robert, for sponsoring our coming out today. As I see it, each of us have shared a similar moment. And in that moment, we were asked to either participate in unlawful conduct or to choose a different path. It boils down to that. None of us ever wanted to be a whistleblower. I'm still not crazy about the name. There was a moment that I was asked or instructed to back off of an investigation of one of Wall Street's elite because he was powerful, because he had prominent contacts, because he was politically influential. And that was a challenging moment because nothing prepared me to deal with that. And the idea of giving preferential treatment, of taking the blindfold off of Lady Justice so she can look at a privileged individual and bow to him, was obnoxious. You know, the rule of law is something that we have subscribed to since we walked out of the jungle and began to form tribes. The Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans have all had codes, criminal codes. You break the law, you're punished for it. It's a crime. The penalties were severe in common law England. People were faced capital punishment for what we now consider trivial crimes. But it's part of the social contract that Rousseau described. We join society. We give up the ability to ignore the law. We subscribe to the law, and it brings order to our lives rather than chaos. Very few are accepted from the principle of law, from the criminal law. When I was a lawyer and in law school, I learned that some of us with mental flaws may be accepted because we don't understand that we're breaking the law. And then there are children whose brains are not fully matured yet. They're accepted from the law. But the most brilliant people, the wealthiest people, the most powerful people, the most influential people, and I'm talking about the CEOs of the Wall Street banks, the CEOs of Goldman Sachs, of Morgan Stanley, of Merrill Lynch. There's no exception for them built into the law. All of the regulations that govern the rule of law, the enforcement of cases at the SEC, direct staff attorneys to prosecute the wealthy, just like they prosecute penny fraudsters. And yet, there's a difference. There's a profound difference in the way the government treats Wall Street. And it operates at every level of government. I've seen it because I've represented whistleblowers inside of government. It exists in the Congressional Budget Office. It exists at the Securities and Exchange Commission. It exists in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. It pervades our entire government. Ferdinand Pecora, who headed the Wall Street investigation in 1933 and 1934, warned us that if we removed the law that contained Wall Street, they would run amok in a heartbeat, and that's what they did from 2005 to 2008. My case at the SEC dealt with, when compared to the dynamics that brought the nation to the knees in 2008, was trivial. It was insider trading. Yes, it was insider trading by the largest hedge fund in the world. And yes, it involved a potential tipster who was the CEO, incoming CEO of a Wall Street bank. But insider trading was not the cause of the financial crisis. But it gave me, almost like an electronic microscope, a look at the government DNA, how they felt about Wall Street. When I got to the SEC, I finished 2 years at Georgetown. I'd gone back to get retooled because I decided at that point in my life, I was 61, I wanted to do something in public service. I had admired the people in law, the judges, the individuals that had dedicated their lives to public service within the law. And so I went back, I retooled at Georgetown, and when at Georgetown, I wrote a thesis which focused on the 1929 crash, the depression that followed, and the formation of the 33 and the 34 acts that formed the Securities and Exchange Commission and created the basic securities laws. So when I arrived at the SEC, I knew its mission. I was intimately familiar with why it was created. I had read Ferdinand Pecora's cross-examination of Wall Street CEOs from cover to cover. I've been through the banking committee's investigative files, the Pecora files. So I was in a case involving the world's largest hedge fund. And I began to look into insider trading cases. The first thing I looked to try to find was, where are the records whether this company has had prior investigations? Did they do this before? I've been a public defender in my 20s, and one thing you learn as a public defender is that the government keeps track of priors. The first thing I learned at the SEC is they didn't. They didn't keep track of priors. So I had to round them up, and I looked around, and I found that this hedge fund was a recidivist. They had constant violations being reported to the Securities and Exchange Commission by the various stock exchanges. So I accumulated 23 different investigations that had been stopped. I narrowed it down to two. I went over and had a chat with the New York Stock Exchange, the market surveillance people. And they told me point blank, there are several major hedge funds that are engaged in insider trading, and they're doing it with the big banks, and nothing's happening about it. And they named those hedge funds: Pequot, Galleon, SAC. And nothing was done about them. It was years later that the SEC supposedly dug out evidence. The evidence was there. All you had to do was go over and ask the New York Stock Exchange. So by the summer of 2005, we narrowed the case down to two cases involving Pequot, both involving the CEO, Art Sandberg. June 15th, I gave a review of the two cases to my supervisors. They were stoked. I met the next day with the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York and the FBI. They opened criminal cases. Same two. 1 week later, the Wall Street Journal ran an article. One of the suspected tipsters was being considered for the CEO of a major Wall Street bank. The word came down from the top. The investigation is not moving forward. I went to see my officer, and that's how I learned. I proposed take the testimony of the CEO, and his response was very simple. I can't let you do that. He has powerful political connections. He's got clout. And he began to name off the people that could call the enforcement division. The names included Mary Jo White, the current chairman of the SEC.
I apologize for the technical difficulties at the end there.